It is a dreary old truth that those who would fight for the poor must fight the poor to do it. That was a quote by Jacob Riis, and today we're going to talk about how we feel about it on the Tonic Accord. So hello, everyone. For those just tuning in for the first time, my name is Drew Nepoli. I work in political media and advertising, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Alex Kapitko, who does policy analysis and is going to get a master's degree in, what is it, public policy and something else?
Yeah, public policy and public administration. Kind of a two-for-one deal, if you want to call it that.
Nice bargain binning. I'm kidding. So today we're going to be talking about this quote, the idea of, if you want to help the poor, sometimes you have to fight the poor to do it. And I guess this can be taken a lot of different ways. And that's kind of what we wanted to do, is just see where this quote leads us in discussion. To me, I immediately think of the idea that often people struggling, people really in impoverished situations, might vote against their own interests or act against their own interests without realizing it, or through persuasion or propaganda. But this quote comes from a person named Jacob Riis, who was I think he was from Denmark, who immigrated to New York City in the late 1800s at the peak of the Gilded Era, right? Industrialization and urbanization at a massive scale in the United States, as well as a ton of new immigration. And so he came to New York City, and he originally started as a police reporter, like doing documentation for police reports, but he started to take a lot of photos, and that led him to doing his own photo series, because he didn't have a lot of money, and he lived in a really rundown area of New York City, and so he started taking photos of this part of New York, and it became a photo novel called How the Other Half Lives, and it really showed how this mass urbanization, especially among immigrants, was leading to tenement housing, basically slum housing, complete lack of regulation and sanitation, terrible working conditions, terrible living conditions. You had people living in homes with no sunlight, no windows, and 6 to 7 people in a small little studio, right? Just crazy living conditions, the kind of things we see in movies about this era of the gangs of New York, those newsy kids running around the muddy streets of the late 1800s. And that's what this guy documented, but no one was really doing it at this time, especially with the photography he was. And it led to this whole kind of, one of his buddies eventually was Theodore Roosevelt, who saw these photos and led to, at the time he was the governor of New York before he became president, and he wanted to change a lot of the tenement housing laws, making sure that there was at least airflow and sunlight in every room, changing the working condition laws, and it raised awareness for how impoverished so many people in America were. But one of the quotes in this book that Jacob Riis says is that idea of if you're fighting for the poor, often you end up fighting the poor to do it. And I thought that was really interesting. So what is your initial take on a quote like that?
Okay, so multiple things here. First, just on Jacob Riis for a second, and kind of this whole early 20th century progressive movement, is that he was instrumental. The fact that employees now, the fact that we have unions in general, which I have my own battles with unions that, would be a great topic in the future, but unions, free airflow, insurance, insurance maps, fire escapes, all these things came from some of the journalism that people like Jacob Riis did. And that early 1900s was a really pivotal point in U.S. history, in my opinion, because we were coming out of, like you said, the Gilded Age, kind of the height of industrialization, and kind of this discussion over, do profits or ethics and humanity, which one supersedes which? And during this early 1900s period, there was a lot of progress in at least giving workers some protections and, getting air in their apartments or fire escapes. And, Jacob Riis, I remember in high school, that was probably I'm really glad you brought this this idea up. So shout out to you, because I think this is a really fascinating topic, because I do remember in high school learning about how the other half lives, and how this basically photo book really showed a lot of people that the people that are running this economy are basically being treated like rats. And so just first off, that's my take on Jacob Riis. I think he was important, and also he came from another country, like you said. So he had this interesting, I think, kind of position to criticize it, but also not be completely an outsider, but also an outsider. And like you said, he made great friends with Theodore Roosevelt, which is probably pretty crucial. Going into that quote, I think one of the biggest barriers that gets in the way of helping to alleviate poverty is messaging. I think people are more enticed by messaging and identity than the facts or the finance. And that's why I think specifically in the West, populism is bad for the working class and bad for getting public support behind complicated policies. People prefer, a shiny object rather than something complex. And I think about Trump, almost everything he supported was detrimental to the working class. Tax cuts, opposition to Medicare, trying to get rid of Obamacare, the trade war with China that hurt working class people, hurt farmers, public health, and Jonathan Metzl, he has a great book called Dying of Whiteness. And he talks about the narrative that many working white class Republicans, especially in the South and Middle America, didn't support Medicare for all because they didn't want welfare queens and immigrants taking their tax dollars. And this was obviously a racial trope that kind of began in the late 70s, early 80s, but it stuck with them. And Metzl says here in quotes, there was an ideology that was more powerful than self-preservation. And that's kind of my issue with nationalism and populism. And I think that feeds this ignorance, is that people are more worried about their identity and their group than they are about actually fixing problems. And populists just make that issue worse. There's another book called Strangers in Their Own Land. And again, it helps make clear that identity and group dynamics can be more important than preservation.
Yes.
The book kind of sets out to explain the worldview of Tea Partiers. And I think she's in Louisiana. And she basically says that it's a changing world, and older people are afraid of these changes. They're afraid of losing their jobs. They're afraid of being held accountable by these corrupt corporations. And they vote for someone like Trump. It's not because he's the best, but because they feel like he's trying to defend their way of life. And to me, it just seems like your way of life and your identity, if someone can harness that message, is more important than actually helping.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Messaging and identity politics, cultural issues have taken precedent over financial realities and self-preservation, and that is not. And while it's been exacerbated in the last 4 or even you could say, I guess, 10 years, it's nothing new either. I think that if you look at the civil rights era in the mid 20th century, it's pretty apparent that the Southern strategy by Republicans was, Republicans basically just decided, look, we're not going to get black voters. We're not. So we're going to double down on, we're going to be okay with getting 10 to 20% of black voters if we get all the angry whites in the South. And so you can see a massive shift. I mean, even right here, looking at Wikipedia, you can see a massive shift right here. 1920, the entire South was blue, and everything else was red. By 1964, the only red states are the Deep South, right? Lyndon V. Johnson versus Barry Goldwater. It's flipped completely, and that strategy was based off of using, ethnic divides, racial agitation, to flip white Southerners to Republicans, and they were completely okay with losing black votes to Democrats because they said, well, if we have the white voters in the South, we'll have the South forever. And so, and there's, again, I forget who it was one of Nixon's strategists who even admitted that is you just have to convince the poor whites that the black guy's taking his money, not us. And you just change the narrative. You don't say the N-word, you say busing. You don't say busing, you say, whatever, whatever. They just change the narrative, and it's so racial agitation as a means to pit poor people against other poor people has been used for a long time. And so I think that plays into that quote as well. Is you can genuinely have the best interest of the downtrodden and poor at heart, but they might be pitted against each other. And it brings me to another point that I think if you're looking at this quote from a politician's point of view, let's say you're seeing that quote of like, I genuinely want to be a civic servant in office and I want to help the poor. But the poor don't want to vote me in, or the poor don't feel that they trust me, or whatever. You have to think about, who are you talking to? The needs, and this is exactly kind of what you're talking about. Is the needs of the urban poor might be completely different than the needs and wants of the rural poor. And when we're talking about urban poor, I am talking about more multiracial, more people of color. I think that there's more an idea in urban environments of like, this is a community issue, right? Like poverty is a community-wide issue, and there's this notion of the community. We need to raise the community up. Whereas I feel that rural poor don't necessarily have that sense of like, my poverty is a community-wide issue, and it's because my community hasn't been invested in. It's more of I'm out here on my own, on my little small farmland, and I want to be left alone, and my poverty is my own doing, or whatever. Or maybe it is because of my larger forces, like my job being sent to China, but it's not this idea of like a community-oriented, like, we need to get out of this rut together. I feel that rural poverty, especially rural whites in America, is a very different mindset than someone who's poor in a city.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of interesting because back in 2018, when I was doing some research for this, I found, guess what? The Economist had a great article on this, and it was called "Why People Vote Against Their Economic Interests." And they mentioned a study from the Gallup polling that basically said that the proportion of Americans who say the gap between the rich and the poor is the most important problem in the U.S., only 2% said that. And now 11% of the people studied said it was immigration. 7% said race relations. And to me and The Economist, there was evidence that this shows that people's identity, like we were talking about, is more important towards race and religious influence than finance. And it's actually kind of surprising and interesting, because I don't really know how you go about actually fixing that issue. Maybe we could get into infrastructure in a little bit. I'd like to stick on this for a second, but I think infrastructure would be a way to maybe put the twos together on that. But I do think, like, going back to it, I think you're right about the Southern strategy, and like a lot of those factors is that, to me, that like there's an entrenched poverty that also has been misinformed about the source.
Right.
Let's see. I took a quote from Dying of Whiteness. Yeah, that's right. It talks about how gun deaths spiked in Missouri, and instead of blaming them on which the likely outcome is suicide, if you give more people with a lot of problems guns, suicides are going to go up. But instead of marketing it or pushing like policy to reform that, it was about gangs. It was about the erosion of values. And gun deaths spiked in Missouri in 2010, and it was mainly white communities and suicide. But the narrative, especially the national narrative, the stuff that our friends like Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity, when I say friends, I mean that very sarcastically for our listeners if you don't know us too well, but they basically said it was because of gangs, MS-13, immigrants. But the reality is, if you have a perfect culmination of like fentanyl abuse, horrible healthcare, poverty, and guns, you're going to see a lot of suicide.
Right.
And Jonathan Metzl, the guy who wrote Dying of Whiteness, talks about between 2008 and 2015, Missouri lost what he quantifies as more than 10,000 years of productive white male life. And he talks about how the mixture between allowing uncontrolled guns to still be out there and denying Medicaid for people who need it costs the average person about 2 weeks of life. And it comes back to all of messaging, but to me it also comes to misinformation. And I think in every way, from QAnon to Trump to even people on the left that think that it's all about race, when, yeah, race is an important factor in inequality, but it's not everything. I think misinformation is the key. And that's something that I almost sympathize with some of these people who are just trying to make ends meet.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, like, they're being informed wrong. Their politicians are telling them the wrong thing. And to me, that's something that would take decades to fix. Like, there is a misinformation campaign that is telling people, look to the other, when in fact, you should actually look in the mirror half the time. And then there's also the fear aspect that I just wanted to mention real quick while I'm thinking about it, is that there's a guy named Robert Reich who has a book called The System, Who Rigged It, and How to Fix It. And he's a Berkeley public policy professor. And he basically mentions an example in West Virginia in 2014 where there was a massive oil spill. Or, no, it wasn't an oil spill, sorry. It was a toxic chemical into West Virginia's river. And that river actually has tributaries that link to Cincinnati and other big cities in that general area. And no one did anything about it. And also the voters didn't do anything about it. The voters didn't care. They didn't know. And also they didn't speak out against the corporation that was responsible for this. And basically Reich's point in this book is that these people want to keep their jobs. And reform and regulation on these giant corporations would mean they'd likely lose their jobs. So a lot of these people would rather have a shitty company than no company.
Right.
And to me, that's another thing, is just fear. People are worried about just, making it to the next day. And unfortunately, the reform that would be needed to do to actually like make these companies, A, pay their employees better, but B, maybe not contaminate a river, that would take reform that would probably mean a loss of jobs. And that's a weird conundrum that the U.S., I think, specifically is in.
I mean, that's where you see why Trump got so popular amongst, people in like blue collar Appalachian industries, like coal mining and all that, like fracking. Like, he got so popular. Like, these people saw their jobs being eradicated, right? You could see these dying coal towns in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, like literally like just being abandoned, ghost towns. And instead of, and again, it's like all these people, like, I understand that they want to have a job. I understand that like they've only known coal mining for so long, but I would say it's against your interest to double down on coal mining when that industry is absolutely going the way of the horse and buggy in the future, right? Like, to double down and do what's maybe short-term feels good, right, and vote for Trump, whereas I think it'd be much better to invest in longer-term, cleaner industries where you can train people and just create new jobs, right? And that's one of those good examples of, like, I may feel that a different opportunity for this person is in their best interest, but they may feel that keeping their current job is in their best interest, and it's hard to say who's right. I believe I'm right, but like it's understandable that someone would be like, no, I don't want to take a risk like that. I need to keep my own job. I'm going to vote for the guy that's at least telling me he's going to keep my job. And then, of course, we found out, a lot of those coal jobs that Trump promised did not stay very long or didn't come back at all. Or the GE plant that was opened by Trump, two others closed in the meantime, right? So, like, it was a lie. And it's just, it's hard to, again, like, that communication, that misinformation is hard to budge, especially when it's tacked onto cultural wedge issues, right? Mm-hmm. Like this idea, like, you and I talk about it outside the podcast all the time about how dangerous the rhetoric of someone like Tucker Carlson is when he talks about replacement theory openly on media primetime. Those kind of ideas and theories get into people's heads and explain things in a way that makes sense to them but are not based in reality. And then you really can't, it's really hard to dig people back. I think there's something super true about this quote from Jacob Riis, because again, and I want to make this clear, that Jacob Riis used to think, because he immigrated to America and he didn't have much in his pocket, but when he was born and raised in Europe, he was from a normal middle class family. Like, he didn't experience poverty in Europe like he did when he went to America and had to like reset and restart from the bottom rung in New York, in the worst time to be in the bottom rung in New York probably ever. So like, seeing this kind of poverty was a shock to him. And when he saw it, it was at a time when most people thought that if you were poor and destitute and you were an alcoholic on the streets of New York, it was your fault. It was by your own doing. It was your own moral compass. Like, it was people, you need to go to church. You need to get right with God because your choices have led you down this path. And obviously people make bad decisions and choices like that can worsen their lives. But Jacob Riis, after doing his photo op, argued that his opinion on poverty had changed to like, no, this is society's fault. People are actually a products of their environment more so than they are just loose individuals that decide to go that path, right? It's obviously a little combination of both, but Jacob Riis argued it is society's fault that we are allowing people to live in poverty like this, and people do feel trapped and can't get out. And so, I think that's one of the things that we have to recognize, that like we're still having that argument today. I feel like today we're still having that argument about, are poor people poor because they're poor on their own choice? Or is it because of society's at fault? I think people like Tucker Carlson genuinely believe that like just bootstraps your way out of there. And it's like, no, man, like this for hundreds of years now, we've had to be convincing people through actual real studies of poverty and getting into poverty and looking at the causes and the problems associated with it, that a lot of it is societal. A lot of it doesn't need to be this way. And people can be brought out of poverty if given the environment and the education and the infrastructure and the so that's a big thing, I think, that we need to glean out of Jacob Riis. But then this quote is so tough because the poor themselves can often be fighting against their own interests. And so I think Trump is a great example of that with the trade war. Another blatant example is the pandemic with mask wearing. It's so blatant that, like, how is there so much misinformation about mask wearing? How it turned into this cultural wedge issue to keep people on their fire up their voting base, when it's like, dude, all it is put a cloth mask on when you go outside. That's literally all you have to do, and it is absolutely in everyone's best interest, including yourself, to do that. And yet there's so much misinformation, and it's turned into a cultural wedge issue. And this is the best example of, like, maybe not necessarily the poor, the public as a whole, but especially the poor that are more likely to have bad health services and more likely to be in more dense living situations. So it still applies to this case. It's like, just wear a mask, and they don't, and you're like, oh my gosh. So I think Jacob Riis's quote more than ever has shown to be true.
Well, first, I mean, I think you're giving Tucker Carlson too much credit. Not that I'm saying you're a Tucker fan, but I honestly think he's just a rich trust funder who went to elitist schools, puts his finger out in the wind, and knows what people want to hear.
Oh, yes, he is that. He is
like I think he's smarter than people give him credit for, and he just knows exactly how to wedge something in.
Yes.
And no, I mean, masks. Masks. I'm not going to get into, because I think both sides have actually made the mask thing more annoying, to be completely honest. Because like, I was out on a Nordic ski a couple weeks ago, and I was out by myself, and I had a lady scream at me to put a mask on. And it's like, I'm outside by myself. I'm not going to put a mask on. There's no science that proves that.
And now the CDC has reflected that now as well.
Right. But I think a lot of the more progressive, more metropolitan people have almost like kind of turned it into a kind of a lecturing about masks.
Who did that first, though, man? Who did that first? Who made it political first? Like, yeah, you might be right that you might be right that the pendulum swing of the ladies yelling at you from across the road to you wear a mask, you might have gotten too far, but it wasn't a political thing until it was made political by Republicans.
No, you're absolutely right. I agree with that. I'm just saying, you don't convince someone through lecturing like that. That's all I'm saying. And I actually really don't want to get into the mask thing, because I think it's kind of a quagmire that we could.
But maybe not in the mask. But what you just said is, how do you communicate then? How do you inform the uneducated of education?
Well, I was reading a study out of The Economist a couple weeks ago that was talking about how even most conservatives actually understand the efficacy of masks. And it took them the last year, unfortunately, behind the curve to do so. But it wasn't people yelling at them to do so. It was watching the science. And I am, like, again, because I actually wanted to make a point back to our discussion on poverty, because I just think the mask thing is an unneeded hill that the conservatives have died on. And I think you wear a mask when it's a packed area, when you're inside. And if you're outside by yourself, there hasn't been evidence from the beginning that wearing a mask outside has ever been necessary. That's all I'm saying. And I think the left, by like scolding people for doing it, has not helped their case. That's all I'm trying to say.
I know, but this goes into our conversation. Is, like you said, that the left had tried scolded people and you feel like it didn't work. Okay, but then how do you then counteract the misinformation campaigns from the right about masks and about vaccines now? Like, how do you counter out that without lecturing someone?
Well, this was a weird example of it, is because the president was a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
And to me, it is a weird asterisk in history of when you had a leader who was not even willing to listen to the experts. I mean, if you look back at the day when he said that he thinks that bleach could have been a necessary solvent for COVID if you ingested it, there was nothing in the briefing before that had anything to do with that. They were basically saying that the evidence showed that between bleach and sunlight, surfaces showed no detection of COVID after a couple hours. And he turned that into,
Right.
well, you can just beat bleach, it's better for my campaign. Also, masks are a form of slavery. And that's something that I think Trump was just the worst leader possible. And it goes back to what I said earlier, is messaging.
Right.
But you don't combat good messaging with scolding. And again, I don't have an answer to that. I will admit that right now. I don't actually know how you go back, because hindsight is 2020. But when you had someone like Trump who had an ego and he knew it was an election year and the economy, or at least the stock market, was booming, I don't particularly know how we could go back and address that, because it was this perfect culmination of events that led to that. And I just feel like the masks in general became this unneeded culture war. I've always worn a mask when I go into a place, if I'm around crowded people, if I'm around people I don't know. To me, it makes sense. It's a barrier between airflow that could be carrying the virus. It makes sense. But it became this thing where Trump started the battle, and it seems like liberals made it worse, in my opinion.
Well, either way, it's a good example of how a stupid misinformation campaign and a stupid cultural wedge issue literally makes people act against their own interest and turn it into this,
Yes.
I will never wear a mask, or like those bars. Like there was a bar in Orange County that in Southern California that banned masks. You could not go in if you had a mask, even for its employees.
That's
even for its employees. And you're like, oh my God, you guys are morons. You are literally morons. Like, it's like,
but it's about telling people, but people are, I think at the end of the day, selfish and simple.
yes.
And that's Democrats, that's Republicans. I actually think Bernie Sanders might be a weird, like, exemption to this, because he was kind of a populist, and he was telling people what they wanted to hear, but he actually might have been right. Like, that's what we need more of, in a weird way, is someone who's honest, direct, and tells people what they want to hear, but maybe there's an ounce of truth to that. There was not a lot of truth with Trump. I did really quick, like, while we were talking about it, like a little bit before the mask thing, is that, like, that's why I just wanted to mention this while we're still here, is that there's a great piece that we had a professor that we did our thesis with senior year at Chapman,
Right.
and he recommended that I read something called Regulating the Poor, The Functions of Public Welfare. And it's by F.F. Peven and Dr. Cloward. It was made in 1972. And basically the argument, and I'm just curious what you think of this, because I just wanted to use this to kind of maintain the bipartisan, like, both sides are corrupt and both sides have their agendas, is that this paper, which I hope I don't get backlash from, it basically argues that the welfare state was kind of committed to maintaining the status quo. And it uses the example of the New Deal, especially, where it basically kind of found the working class people and made them reliant on the welfare state. And benefits actually diminished during that time, but their need and force, like somewhat their in servitude to work, grew. And basically what the New Deal did, according to these authors, was it basically found poor people. Unfortunately, a majority of them in the South were African Americans. And it basically said, we are going to make you a servitude of the state, a servant of the state. And it basically took for granted people that they knew, if we keep giving you handouts, you're going to keep voting for us. And it was an interesting thing that FDR thought of, because FDR, from all accounts that I've read, was a racist and was not particularly a very open guy in terms of, like, bringing the party to be a party of, like, working minorities. But they found that they could get a good voting base and maintain the capitalist system if they found marginalized or struggling individuals who they could kind of put on the state's dime and keep them adherent to the system.
I believe that. I believe that. I believe that that's was going through the head. Lyndon Johnson is notoriously a racist, and one of the biggest proponents of the Civil Rights Act. Right? Like, I believe that. I don't think that necessarily then means that we have to always approach any kind of welfare as, oh, well, then now you're putting that group of people in slavery or servitude, right? I understand that argument, and I think that certainly if you're creating welfare, like you don't want to have it where it's like some kind of weird, like you have to make sure that the parameters around it are allowing people to have social mobility and not get stuck in a rut where they're just, you know, living to work for the government or whatever. But again, I see what you're saying in that sense, where even something on the surface might even look beneficial to the poor, but then long-term effects keep them impoverished. And certainly we need to be vigilant of that. But I also don't think that then can be extended to, we should always be that cautious of welfare, right? Then if something's welfare, then it immediately means then we're turning a working class into slaves of the state. That's not something I don't think we should apply to like today's discussion around a robust social safety net.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, but do you think, for the sake of discussion,
Sure.
and it's something that I always take out of this, is that, do you think in some ways the Democratic Party has taken minorities kind of as a given?
Yes,
like, because
absolutely.
Yeah.
We saw it with Trump. Trump, while not getting nearly enough support among minorities to really flip anything hugely, he did gain. He gained way more than like milquetoast candidates like Romney among black voters and among Latino voters especially. And so, yeah, I mean, there is definitely, I definitely feel that like elite coastal liberal idea of like, we'll always have the minorities on our side, right? We're the Democrats. The Republicans will never have. And one of the reasons Republicans don't get a lot of minorities on their side is because of using ethnic rhetoric and racial agitation to fire up their base, right? So, I mean, there are reasons why we see the discrepancy in voting habits, but I do certainly think that you're right, that there probably is an air of, on the Democratic side, of like, yeah, we'll always be good with black people, when you shouldn't think that. I've always still thought, I still argue today about the transactional politics of like, if you want to get votes from people, give them something in return. Don't just think you're safe on identity, right? Even though our current political structure is so based on identity wedge issues, I don't think it's wedge issues, and culture changes rapidly. So I don't think that's a good long-term strategy. I think longer-term strategy, transactionally give people what they want and they will vote for you. So I think the Democrats certainly need to do more of that. And yes, I mean, look, I mean, if you want to look at racism in politics in America, it is. I'm by no means suggesting it's like Republicans were the racist and the Democrats were the good guys. That's a so naive way to look at history, and racism in general. So yeah, I mean, absolutely, racism was involved in Democratic legislation, even in the Civil Rights Act period, and of course. You shouldn't take any voting bloc group for granted. As we've seen through the Southern strategy, within a few decades, an entire voting shift can happen.
Exactly. And just to maybe kind of slowly wrap this up, but on a somewhat of a rosy note, or maybe a looking to the future note, John Boehner, who I'm reading his book on the House, I think he's one of the last sensible speakers of the House. Better than our friend Kevin McCarthy, who's a minority guy, but if he was speaker, I'd be terrified. But basically, John Boehner has a quote. He says, you can find common ground with others without having to compromise your own beliefs. That's how you actually get things done. And I think that quote is absolutely correct. You don't need to compromise and diminish your own positions, but you find what you have in common with the other side. And to me, Biden's infrastructure plan could be that. That is something that would help both urban cities on the coast and rural, middle, and southern America. And Republican, congressmen and women and senators disagree with Biden's infrastructure plan, but the American people, there's a majority that believe in it. And
A healthy
You
majority.
know, yeah, a very healthy majority. And to me, it shows is that that's where common ground could be found. Tangible things that could help people. Wireless internet in rural areas, better roads, bridges,
Right.
maternity leave, childcare. These are things that could help people and could maybe at least give them the chance to rise out of poverty or something like that.
Well, and it's not a cultural wedge issue, right? Like it's,
Right.
everyone hates potholes on your road. No one is like, oh, I identify as an American with the potholes in my road. Like, no, being an American is barbecues on July 4th, not the potholes in my road. That's not fixing my road is not an affront on my identity, whether it's a left or right, whatever. So yeah, I mean, those kind of issues, absolutely, I think are easier to communicate to the uneducated and the poor and those that desperately need infrastructure revamping. I'm shocked that Republicans want to make this another hill to die on. They really just want to. They just don't want to do anything Biden wants to do. So that whole unity thing is out the window completely, in my opinion. I say screw them. Go through as many. Get an infrastructure plan. I was hoping for an infrastructure plan from Trump, man. I mean, I've been saying it for a while. When he first got elected, I was actually like, well, hopefully he does something with infrastructure. He says he's a builder, and he never did anything. So I've been waiting for infrastructure for years. So yeah, I hope that something like Biden's infrastructure plan can make it through and really help America. But certainly it goes to show that any kind of I bet you even that will be turned into a cultural wedge issue, just like Medicaid, right? Just like Obamacare was, and making it more about Obama than it was about the care.
Mm-hmm.
It's baffling, but it's a good thing to reminder. It's a good way to reflect on the way we communicate things to people, the way we view progress, and the way we view the poor and uneducated. Right? They are not all the same. Of course not. It'd be ridiculous to think that they are, and to think about the different needs of rural poor, poor whites, poor blacks in America, and how all these different things relate to each other is important. So I hope that you gleaned something. I certainly gleaned a lot from looking at all this stuff and looking back at Jacob Riis and learning more of his. And also, by the way, for anyone that don't know, his photo book and book that we mentioned, How the Other Half Lives, is available for free completely online at Gutenberg.org. They have a lot of free archived stuff. A lot of stuff from this era is past its trademark or whatever, and it's just kind of public access. So if you're interested in reading that book from Jacob Riis and getting illustrations as well as real photos from the slums of New York in that era, super fascinating. And a lot of it still applies today. We didn't even get into the part about homelessness where he talks about the things he sees around homelessness and things he thinks that could help that, and how it almost all still applies today in places like New York and Los Angeles. Crazy. Anyway, anything last you want to say to end this episode, Alex, before we head out of here?
Well, I'll just end it with a light but stupid comment. Is the Republicans and Fox News already have an answer to Biden's infrastructure proposal? They are talking about the Green New Deal and the fact that we're all going to be drinking plant-based beer.
Yes.
That's their new hill to die on. And Drew, I don't know if you were drinking bacon-based beer last time we talked. I thought beer was plant-based, but they always find a misinformed wedge issue that people understand. But like you said, Jacob Riis, I never read or looked at How the Other Half Lives, except for I remember my history test in high school, but I actually might look back in that. So I want to thank you, my friend, for bringing this quote to attention, because I think it actually sums up so much. So props to you.
It's a chunky one. All right. Well, thank you guys for watching and listening to the Tonic Accord. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, and a host of third-party sites, as well as we live stream on Twitch at 5 p.m. on Tuesdays Pacific time. So check us out at Twitch or YouTube Live. Be sure to comment, leave a follow, leave a like, and thank you for watching.